Okay, moving along here in week 6 material, we're going to talk about interest groups here this video. So if you got your PowerPoint, go to slide number 29. One of the things that various groups within our country, okay, when you talk about interest groups, okay, there's environmentalist groups, there's groups that are, for more traditional conservative family values. There are groups that are for more radical values, okay? Think something like Black Lives Matter right now, okay? These are interest groups. And one of the ways you can influence government is through something called lobbying, okay? And it means just efforts by groups to influence public policy by contacting public officials, okay? In other words, lobbying is when, okay, can I influence a politician? Sure I can. I can write them a letter, I can send them an email, I can call them, I can try to reach out to them in some way and have lunch with them, perhaps, okay? But if I've got a group of people whose full-time job and they get paid to basically camp out in Washington and go over to the congressman's office every day and talk with them if they can, okay, they're going to be much more influential, okay? That's where lobbyists come in. Okay, they're professional people whose sole job is to influence public policy by connecting with public officials, okay? There's 20,000 lobbyists that work in Washington, okay? And they are regulated, okay? But that's a lot of folks to influence government, okay? So if you go to slide number 30, talking about acquiring access to officials, again, there's something, a lot of it, the lobbying is called inside lobbying, okay? It's weekly direct access to officials to influence their decisions, okay? Again, they contact policymakers with information and things of that nature. And again, they're trying to, influence policymakers that are inclined to support their group. They're not necessarily going after those that are totally, diametrically opposed to their group. That would be a waste of time, effort, energy, money, and so on and so forth, okay? So union lobbyists work mainly with pro-labor office holders. Corporate lobbyists work with politicians to support business interests, okay? Things like that. There's something called a revolving door. And to me, this is something that requires reform, okay? So in other words, some lobbyists become politicians, and then once they're done being politicians, they become lobbyists. In other words, a politician who understands everything about the system basically loses his, okay, let me say it another way. Don't feel sorry for a politician that loses, especially if they become a lobbyist. They probably end up making more money as a lobbyist, and on top of that, they know the inside game in Washington, so this revolving door. I know one of the things that President Trump was working on, I can't remember where this is at, but he tried to set it up to where you could not, if you were a politician, you lose an election, you could not be a lobbyist for like 5 to 7 years after that. Okay, so again, you can see where this can kind of feed on itself. And, in other words, is the politician more sympathetic to your interests as a citizen or more sympathetic to the lobbyist group? Because not only is he a politician, but he also, as a politician, worked for the lobbyist group and then went to be a politician and then went back to work for that lobbyist group. In other words, it begs the question, where does that congressman or congresswoman's interests lie? With the electorate or with these lobbyists, okay? In other words, legitimate need for reform, perhaps. So different forms of lobbying, okay? Lobbying Congress is probably what is perhaps more, you may be more familiar with that. But again, there's individuals that, are camp out in Washington and try to influence congressmen to, pass a particular bill that will help their group, okay? Safe lobbying is to try to be above board, okay? To provide information, to rely on trusted allies in Congress, to push steadily but not too aggressively for favorable legislation. Again, this happens all the time. Then there is lobbying the executive, okay, the president, which you can imagine it's harder, okay? In other words, the president and the presidential staff is, It's very hard to influence them because it's very hard to get access to them. So you find top officials in federal agencies. Okay, what are federal agencies? Remember, you got the executive branch, the president, vice president, members of his cabinet, and then you've got all of these executive agencies. The director of the FBI, the director of the CIA, the director of Health and Human Services, the director of Homeland Security, the director of the IRS, right? In other words, you've got all of these agency heads. And that's how lobbyists will approach those guys or those gals to try to influence them, and then indirectly the president, okay? And so one of the things that happens is something called agency capture, okay? And what that means is that over time, regulatory agencies tend to side with the very industries that they are supposed to regulate rather than with the public they are supposed to protect. Again, you've got this, like this symbiotic relationship between, you've got lobbyists, you've got the federal agency, and then you got the particular business whose interest is represented, and they kind of all work together. It's something called an iron triangle, which I'll show you in a moment here, okay? So that's a form of lobbying. Another form of lobbying is lobbying the courts, where interest groups will try to influence court decisions, okay, Supreme Court decisions. What's interesting about that is, again, Supreme Court justices are supposed to be the most insulated branch of government, where they are not, capital M, capital O, capital T, supposed to decide based on the lobbying of interest groups, okay? But nevertheless, basically there are groups that lobby them, and they create something called amicus briefs. And these are briefs based on, again, you got, example here, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. And you've got, all kinds of other groups that basically file a brief, basically maybe research or something that argues for their particular cause, that they submit to the lawyers representing the particular sides and the Supreme Court justices, hoping that they will read them as they make their decision, okay? And so that is a way to do it. In other words, if you look up any Supreme Court decision, in the last 30, 40 years, you can look it up on the internet. It's very easy to do. And usually before the rendering from the court and from the justices, you will see, all these groups represented and their amicus briefs. Again, this is lobbying. Okay, is it a problem? Yeah, it's a problem in the sense that, well, first of all, both sides do it, conservatives and liberals, and so as a strategy, right now it's allowed, so they do it, but it is not what the founders of our system created. They did not want the justices to be influenced by that. To loosely quote Alexander Hamilton in Federalist number 78, he said that in the Supreme Court has neither force nor will, merely judgment. In other words, judge what the Constitution says. Don't be influenced by force or will. Are amicus briefs force and will? Yeah, they are. So here's some examples. Again, looking at what Justice Antonin Scalia said in two cases, okay, about the dangers of amicus briefs, the dangers of lobbying the courts, okay? Here's what he said in Webster versus Reproductive Health Services. Alone sufficiently to justify a broad holding is the fact that our retaining control through Roe, talking about Roe versus Wade, this is an abortion case, of what I believe to be, and many of our citizens recognize to be, a political issue, continuously distorts the public perception of the role of this court. We can now look forward to at least another term with carts full of mail from the public and the streets full of demonstrators urging us, the unelected and life-tenured judges who have been awarded those extraordinary undemocratic characteristics precisely in order that we might follow the law despite popular will, to follow the popular will. Okay, so he's saying, basically he's poking at these amicus briefs. He's poking at, again, the American public, trying to stir their thinking when, their office, okay, was designed to not be influenced by the will of the people. Okay, again, that the idea of having impartial judges not influenced by the will of the people or amicus briefs was a good thing, not a bad thing. But again, this happens today. His dissent in Planned Parenthood versus Casey was similar, okay? Another abortion case. And what he says is, in truth, I am as distressed as the court is, and expressed my distress several years ago about the political pressure directed toward the court, the marches, the mail, the protests aimed at inducing us to change our opinions. How upsetting it is that so many of our citizens, good people, not lawless ones, on both sides of this abortion issue and on various sides of other issues as well, think that we justices should properly take into account their views as though we were engaged not in ascertaining an objective law, but in determining some kind of social consensus, okay? What branch of government is supposed to take into account social consensus? The legislature, right? Congress. That's their job. That's what they're supposed to do. That's how the framers set up our system of government. And Scalia's argument is a good one because he's saying, listen, why are you lobbying us? That's not our job. That's not what we're supposed to do, okay? Most of the judges, many of them, just discard a lot of the mail. They get mail from people. Harry Blackman, one of the justices that I wrote about in my book, he got just tens of thousands of mail because he wrote Roe versus Wade, arguably the most controversial Supreme Court decision ever made. And he read every one of them. He was very much swayed by public opinion. He wanted to know what people thought of his decisions, okay? If James Madison were here and he was hearing this, he's like, no, that is exactly what we didn't set up the system to be about. Not for the judges, at least. But lobbying does happen, okay? Finally, talking about iron triangles, okay? Again, this symbiotic relationship between lobbyists, bureaucrats in the executive agencies and Congress, okay? An iron triangle, this is on slide number 35. An iron triangle consists of a small and informed but relatively stable set of bureaucrats, legislators, and lobbyists who seek to develop policies beneficial to particular interests, okay? But they benefit every one of them, okay? So the three corners of such a triangle is, in this case, the Department of Agriculture, which is informed by agricultural committees by Congress, which is in turn informed by farm groups such as the American Milk Producers lobbyists, okay? So together they determine many of the policies affecting farmers, okay? So this symbiotic relationship tends to skew, what Congress is doing and what these federal agencies is doing, not to reflect what the will of the people want, but the will of what these lobbyists want, and whoever's squawking the loudest, and however, the greatest amount of money thrown at this tends to influence this, okay? And so groups embedded in these iron triangles have an inside track to well-positioned legislators and bureaucrats. And so if you look at slide number 36, you can kind of see this, okay? Where the interest group, through lobbyists, tries to influence Congress, okay? Who in turn is influencing the bureaucracies, and it goes round and round and round, okay? President Reagan in 1989, following his presidency, was asked, what was the toughest part of your presidency? He said, I tried to dismantle these iron triangles because I realize it subverts democracy. Is that these federal agencies are not reflecting the will of the people. They're reflecting the will of bureaucrats and the will of lobbyists. And he said after 8 years of being the president, he said it was the toughest nut to crack, okay? This would be an example of the swamp, okay? This is an example of what President Trump has been trying to do in draining the swamp. This is the reason why there's so much of an outcry against him from many of these agency heads, because they're so territorial. They do not want reform within their agencies, okay? Again, you've got to realize that. Again, trust me, Trump has enough things that he has messed up in things he said or Twitter or whatever, but one of the things that I personally believe is a good thing is trying to reform, the executive agencies, and there's a lot of pushback from it. So again, kind of interesting there. But I'll stop here, and we'll conclude this lesson with talking about the media next.